rainwater. What's wrong with our spring, with our lakes, with our rivers? Well, in reality, we know the answer.
Dependency. A new abundance of imports has replaced the old abundance of nature. We have embraced colonial tastes, but at the cost of our own independence. The Ivory Coast is largely an extension of France. The economy and currency remain tied to Paris. We once gave away our gold in exchange for beads from Europe. The Ivory Coast has surrendered its wealth and autonomy in return for shimmering glass. The French colonial government has gone, but the French bureaucrats remain, and their priorities usually predominate. Western priorities are still the bugbear of independent Africa. This is Mozambique, whose people are going hungry, and yet the country continues to export sugar.
This sugar mountain is not part of a fairy tale of sweet abundance. If anything, it's part of Africa's nightmare, dependency, export crops in the midst of local starvation, domestic famine. If we paid half as much attention to the storage and processing of basic foods as we do to the storage and processing of export crops, Africa's lean years would be drastically reduced.
The cargo is destined for London, for the Englishman's fourth meal, afternoon tea. Alas, not everybody has sugar from a silver spoon.
This tea story in Kericho is part of a much wider saga, nothing less than the impact of Europe's sweet tooth on the history of the world and on Africa's destiny. It's an influence that extends all the way from the plantations of Jamaica to this tea hotel in Kenya. It began with sugar itself, Europe's increasing demand for sugar. So Africans were exported to the West Indies to grow it for European confectionaries and tea houses. And then, with colonialism, came dessert and beverage economies. Economies like this one of Kenya, with its emphasis on both coffee and tea, or that of Ghana, with its emphasis on cocoa for European chocolate. These were fundamentally incidental food crops. But a nagging question has arisen. Have we been producing these crops at the expense of fundamental food needs, like grain, meat, and root crops? Were we indeed so preoccupied with responding to the sweet tooth of Europe that we had forgotten our own hungry mouths? When you see a man driving in a straight line along Kampala Road, he must be drunk. Well, it's a Ugandan joke about a bad Ugandan road. But the joke is applicable to this road also in Ghana. It's the main road north-south, it's the main artery. Arguably, it's the most important road in the nation. And yet, look at it. Halls and halls and halls, sometimes miles of utter disrepair. It tells us a lot about the state of communications in Africa. It tells us a lot about the African condition. It was Julius Nyerere, the founder president of Tanzania, who once said, while the great powers are trying to get to the moon, we are trying to get to the village. Well, the great powers have been to the moon and back, and even the stars are getting closer with every improvement in space communication. But we in Africa are still trying to get to the village.
If we ever do get to the village, we may never be able to get back. Communications in much of Africa are indeed a disaster. This is the second demon of post-colonial Africa, the demon of decay alongside the devil of dependency. The rust and the dust are descending upon Africa as roads crumble, telephones go silent, institutions atrophy, and rails decay. Particularly poignant to me is the decay of a place of learning, like this village school in a country once prosperous, Ghana.
Some of the walls are beginning to crumble. Fewer desks every year, a leg broken here and there. And yet, that's not the worst of it. What is increasingly painful is the absence of the basic teaching materials, of paper, of pens. This school spent a whole term without those basic materials. Someone exclaimed, "Why not write to the head of state and complain?" Someone else answered, "Write? With what?" There may be more at stake here than the slow death of a school. There may be the slow death of a civilization. We may be witnessing the beginning of the end of Western culture as we have known it in Africa.
In disillusion, Chrysanthus Azeriwe has taken his son out of the same village school in Ghana. There was a time when the hunger for Western-style education all over Africa was enormous. Now there is a crisis of confidence. What's the point of going to school when the school can't provide education? What's the point of being educated at all if there are no jobs at the end of it? The cash economy created wage labor, but where there are no jobs, there are no wages. The cash system is in disarray. This is another colonial institution inherited from the West which has not taken root. Cues of desperation. These mothers in Ghana are looking to the armed forces for alternatives to decayed hospitals and shrinking medical services. There are clinics without drugs, nurses without bandages, doctors without hypodermic needles. The sickest patient of all is the health service itself.
Your friend is saying?
Some of the preceding political regimes had wasted and plundered a lot of foreign exchange. This latest military government is trying to make amends. But both the decaying hospitals and the fragile governments are themselves symptoms of a wider social malaise, the double sickness of things falling apart alongside failing economies dependent on outsiders. The Barabeg of Tanzania have all